Think the Wild West was all about the Winchester 73 and a few famous lever actions you've seen in every Hollywood Western? Think again. Behind the legends were rifles that never made it into dime novels, silver screen shootouts, or museum walls. Rifles so rare, so unusual, and sometimes so downright strange that they've been almost completely forgotten, even though cowboys, soldiers, outlaws, and settlers once carried them across the frontier. Today, we're digging deep into the hidden corners of firearms history to reveal the 15 rarest rifles of the Wild West. These weren't always the fastest or the deadliest, but they tell a side of frontier life you've probably never heard. From experimental bolt actions that were decades ahead of their time, to foreign imports carried by immigrants, to bizarre breech loaders that look nothing like the rifles you thought tamed the West. This isn't the Wild West you know, it's the Weird West. And once you see what made these forgotten rifles so unique, you'll never look at frontier gunfighting the same way again. So, saddle up, because some of these rifles will absolutely shatter everything you thought you knew about the Old West. If you love uncovering hidden history and frontier myths, hit that like button. It helps us keep these rare stories alive. And if you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss our deep dives into the Wild West's most dangerous legends. Number 15. The Star Carbine, the forgotten cavalry rifle. Before the West was dominated by Winchesters and trapdoors, there was a rifle that briefly armed Union cavalry and trickled out onto the frontier, the Star Carbine of the 1850s and 60s. At first glance, the Star looks plain compared to the elegant lever actions that followed, but for its time, it was a solid breech-loading carbine designed to give mounted troops more speed and firepower than their muzzle-loading muskets could ever allow. Imagine a Civil War skirmish where soldiers no longer had to stand exposed, ramming powder and ball down a barrel. Instead, they could simply pop in a paper cartridge, close the breech, and fire again. That was revolutionary for cavalry. Chambered in .52 caliber, the Star Carbine saw heavy issue during the Civil War, with more than 20,000 produced. After the fighting ended, many of these surplus rifles wound up in the hands of settlers, lawmen, and even outlaws moving westward. They weren't flashy, but they were rugged, dependable, and cheap. Qualities that mattered more than anything on the frontier. Still, the Star Carbine had flaws. It was heavier and more awkward than some of its competitors, like the Sharps or Spencer. And when metallic cartridges began to take over, its paper cartridge system quickly became obsolete. By the 1870s, it was fading fast from use. But for a brief moment in time, the Star Carbine bridged the gap between the muzzle-loading past and the repeating future. It may not have the fame of a Winchester, but without rifles like the Star, the evolution of frontier firepower would have looked very different. And while the Star played it safe with a conventional single trigger, the next rifle on our list went in a far stranger direction, using a system so unusual, it left most shooters scratching their heads. Number 14. The Terry Carbine, the British outsider. Not every rifle in the American West was homegrown. A few were foreign imports, oddball designs that trickled across the Atlantic and ended up in the hands of settlers or veterans. One of the strangest was the British-made Terry Carbine. Patented in the 1850s, the Terry used a distinctive bolt-like breech that fired special paper cartridges. It was innovative for its day, and the British military even adopted it briefly. But by the time a handful reached American shores through surplus sales and immigrant trunks, metallic cartridges were already taking over. On the frontier, that made the Terry stand out as a curiosity rather than a practical weapon. Imagine being in Dodge City and seeing a rifle that didn't take brass at all, but delicate paper rounds that had to be handled with care. Compared to the rugged Winchesters and trapdoors most frontiersmen trusted, the Terry must have looked foreign and finicky, almost out of place. What makes it fascinating today is its rarity. Very few Terrys ever crossed into the American West, and those that did were often odd keepsakes from immigrant families or bargain surplus rifles bought by settlers who couldn't afford something better. Here's the legacy. The Terry wasn't a frontier staple, but it reminds us that the Old West wasn't armed solely with American icons. Foreign firearms like this occasionally showed up, adding unexpected variety to the guns of the frontier. And because so few survived in the US, an authentic Terry with Western provenance is almost impossible to find today. Number 13. The Burnside Carbine, the awkward invention. Long before lever actions dominated the frontier, there was a cavalry carbine with a bold new idea, and a handful of serious flaws. This was the Burnside Carbine, patented in the 1850s by none other than Ambrose Burnside, who would later become a Civil War general and the namesake of sideburns. The Burnside was one of the first American carbines to use a metallic cartridge, but not the kind you're used to. Instead of the standard brass case, Burnside designed a unique, cone-shaped brass cartridge that sealed at the breech when fired. In theory, this solved the common problem of gas leakage and made reloading quicker than with paper cartridges. On paper, it seemed brilliant. In reality, not so much. The cone-shaped cartridges were tricky to manufacture, fragile in the field, and completely non-standard. If you ran out of ammo on the frontier, you couldn't just buy more at a trading post. You needed Burnside's odd proprietary rounds. And though over 50,000 of these carbines were issued during the Civil War, soldiers often complained about stuck cases and awkward handling. After the war, a fair number of Burnside carbines filtered westward as surplus. Settlers and lawmen bought them cheap, but the oddball ammunition made them impractical for long-term use. Side by side with the more versatile Spencer or Sharps, the Burnside looked like a clever but clumsy experiment. Yet despite its flaws, the Burnside deserves credit. It was one of the first steps toward the metallic cartridge future, even if its unusual design ultimately doomed it. Today, surviving Burnside carbines are prized by collectors precisely because of their oddity. So here's the question. Would you have trusted your life to Burnside's awkward invention, or held out for something simpler and more reliable? Number 12. The Jocelyn Carbine, the side opening experiment. When most people picture Civil War or frontier rifles, they imagine lever actions like the Winchester or heavy single shots like the Sharps. But in the 1860s, there was a breech loader that looked and operated like nothing else, the Jocelyn Carbine. Designed by Benjamin Jocelyn, this carbine featured a distinctive side-hinged breech block. Instead of dropping a round into the top or pushing it into a magazine, you'd flip open the breech to the side, slip in a metallic cartridge, and snap it shut. For cavalry soldiers used to fumbling with paper cartridges and percussion caps, this was a revelation. The Jocelyn was issued in both .52 and .56 caliber and saw extensive use during the Civil War, with over 20,000 produced. After the war, many of these rifles were sold off as surplus, winding up in the hands of settlers, native scouts, and pioneers heading west. They weren't flashy, but their solid breech and metallic cartridges gave them a big edge in reliability compared to older designs. In terms of innovation, the Jocelyn was ahead of its time. That sideways hinged breech was simple, sturdy, and easy to operate on horseback. But it wasn't without issues. The early models sometimes had problems with gas leakage and stuck cartridges. And as newer repeaters like the Spencer and Winchester came onto the scene, the Jocelyn started to look outdated. Side by side with a Winchester 73, the Jocelyn looked plain, even old-fashioned. But for soldiers and settlers who just needed a dependable rifle, it was practical and effective. And here's the myth-busting truth. While Hollywood loves to show every cowboy with a shiny lever action, the reality is that many frontiersmen carried surplus Civil War rifles like the Jocelyn. They were affordable, available, and just good enough to see you safely across the frontier. Number 11. The Ballard Rifle, the hunter's companion. Not every rifle on the frontier was a famous Winchester lever action or a massive military musket. Some of the most reliable and surprisingly influential rifles were the ones chosen by hunters, trappers, and settlers who needed a practical gun for everyday survival. One of the most overlooked of these was the Ballard rifle. First introduced in the 1860s, the Ballard was a single-shot, breech-loading rifle available in a wide variety of calibers, from small rimfires to powerful buffalo hunting rounds. It quickly earned a reputation for accuracy and toughness, making it a favorite among target shooters and long-range hunters. Its most distinctive feature was its simplicity. The Ballard's falling block action was easy to operate, sturdy under heavy use, and capable of handling some of the largest cartridges of its day. For a buffalo hunter on the plains or a frontiersman putting food on the table, that combination of strength and accuracy was priceless. Of course, it wasn't without flaws. Being a single shot, the Ballard could never match the rate of fire of repeaters like the Spencer or Winchester. And compared to the more famous Sharps rifles, the Ballard was produced in smaller numbers, which meant fewer people on the frontier recognized its potential. But here's the truth. Hollywood ignores. While the movies love to show every cowboy with a Winchester, many real hunters carried rifles like the Ballard. Its reliability and accuracy often mattered more than firepower, especially when one well-placed shot could make the difference between bringing down a buffalo or going hungry. Today, surviving Ballard rifles are highly collectible. A gun that once rode in a buffalo hunter's wagon or hung above a homesteader's fireplace can now fetch thousands at auction. Proof that sometimes the forgotten workhorses of the frontier were just as important as the legends. Number 10. The Hall Rifle, The frontier oddball. If there was one place in the Wild West where firearms were guaranteed to be tested, it was the battlefield. And long before lever actions ruled the frontier, an odd breech-loading rifle was already rewriting the rules. Enter the Hall rifle. Adopted by the U.S. Army as early as 1819, the Hall was one of the very first breech-loading rifles ever issued in quantity. At a time when nearly every soldier was still ramming powder and ball down the muzzle, the Hall allowed its user to simply flip open the breech block, drop in a cartridge, and fire again. For the 1820s and 30s, this was groundbreaking technology. By the time of the Civil War, the Hall was largely obsolete, but surplus rifles still found their way into frontier hands. Chambered in .52 caliber, it gave settlers, militia, and even some native scouts a faster-firing alternative to the old musket. While it lacked the repeating firepower of later Spencers or Winchesters, its breech-loading design meant it could be reloaded from a prone position or on horseback. A life-saving advantage compared to muzzle loaders. Side by side with a Winchester, the Hall looked ancient, even clumsy. Its accuracy was decent, but gas leakage around the breech was a persistent problem, sometimes even burning the shooter's face. Still, it represented a crucial stepping stone between the slow single-shot muskets of the early 19th century and the repeating rifles that would define the frontier. And here's the part most people forget. While Hollywood loves to show sleek lever actions in every saloon or standoff, many real pioneers and militias carried leftover rifles like the Hall. They weren't glamorous, but they were affordable, available, and good enough for survival. Of course, the Hall was far from perfect, but its breech-loading system set the stage for the metallic cartridge revolution. And while the Hall was a relic by the time the frontier truly opened, the next rifle on our list took innovation in a whole new direction, introducing a clever system that tried to stretch firepower without sacrificing simplicity. Number 9. The Maynard Carbine, the working man's breech loader. When the frontier was still filling up with leftover muskets and overpriced Winchesters, there was one rifle that promised a simpler, cheaper way to get repeating firepower. That was the Maynard Carbine, a breech loader that never reached Colt-level fame but became the practical choice for thousands of working men heading west. Designed by Dr. Edward Maynard, a dentist-turned-inventor, this carbine stood out for its unusual brass cartridges. Unlike standard metallic rounds, Maynard's design was reusable. After firing, you could pop out the empty case, reload it with powder and ball, cap it, and use it again. For a settler scraping by on a tight budget, the ability to stretch your ammunition was no small advantage. The Maynard saw widespread service during the Civil War, especially with cavalry, and after the fighting ended, many found their way into the hands of farmers, ranchers, and small-town sheriffs on the frontier. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't a prestige rifle, but it was dependable, accurate, and affordable. Mechanically, the Maynard was simple and rugged. Its tilting breech block made reloading quick, and the solid design gave it a reputation for reliability even under hard use. Sure, it lacked the rapid fire of a Spencer or the prestige of a Sharps, but for everyday folks it was good enough, and often the only rifle they could afford. And here's the twist. While history celebrates the Winchester as the rifle that won the West, far more ordinary settlers probably carried surplus Maynards or other Civil War carbines. They were cheap, available at local trading posts, and did the job without breaking the bank. Ironically, because so many were worn out through daily use, surviving Maynard carbines are much rarer today than their fancier competitors. So, what about you? If you were a pioneer heading west, would you have spent big on a famous Winchester or saved your money with the practical Maynard? Number 8. The Hotchkiss Repeating Rifle, the forgotten cavalry arm. Some rifles became icons of the frontier. Others slipped quietly into obscurity. The Hotchkiss repeating rifle belongs to the second group, a gun that saw real service with the U.S. cavalry yet is barely remembered today. Developed in the late 1870s, the Hotchkiss was a bolt-action repeater that carried its cartridges in a unique tube magazine running through the buttstock. Instead of a lever under the receiver like a Winchester, you'd cycle a bolt and feed rounds from behind your shoulder. A clever system that freed the action for more powerful cartridges. The U.S. Army ordered a limited number of Hotchkiss rifles, issuing them to cavalry units in the 1880s. On paper, it was supposed to give mounted troops a rugged repeater that fired the same .45-70 cartridge as the Springfield Trapdoor. In reality, the unusual stock-mounted magazine made it slow to reload and tricky to handle in the heat of combat. A few surplus Hotchkiss rifles filtered westward after their military service, winding up in the hands of settlers and scouts. They weren't flashy, but they were reliable, accurate, and carried serious firepower compared to older surplus muskets. Still, they never caught on the way Winchesters or even Trapdoors did, and their odd design faded quickly from use. Collectors today see the Hotchkiss as an experiment that came just a little too early. It was durable, innovative, and offered repeating fire with a full power cartridge, but it lacked the speed and smoothness of the lever actions that already dominated the West. Here's the legacy twist. Surviving Hotchkiss rifles are scarce not because they were unpopular, but because so few were built in the first place. If the design had been refined and mass-produced, it might have rewritten the story of frontier firepower. So here's the question. If you were a cavalryman in the 1880s, would you have trusted the Army's oddball Hotchkiss, or stuck with the familiar swing of a Winchester lever action? Number 7. The Remington-Lee rifle, the everyman's bolt action. When we picture the Wild West, we tend to imagine every cowboy toting a Winchester lever action or a Springfield Trapdoor. But here's the truth. Most settlers couldn't afford the most famous models, or they bought whatever the Army declared obsolete. That's where the Remington-Lee comes in, one of the earliest American bolt-action rifles, and one that never quite got its due. Introduced in 1878, the Remington-Lee was chambered in .45-70, the same powerful cartridge as the Army's Trapdoor Springfield. Its key feature was its bolt-action system with a tubular magazine under the barrel, a radical departure from the lever actions and single shots everyone was used to. For the first time, Remington was offering an affordable repeating rifle that looked more modern than anything else on the frontier. On paper, it should have been a hit. In practice, not so much. The bolt action was slower to cycle than a Winchester lever, and the underbarrel magazine made it heavier than it needed to be. The U.S. Navy and Indian Bureau purchased small numbers, but the Army passed on it, preferring the simpler Trapdoor. Without a big government contract, production stayed limited, and only a few thousand were ever made. For working-class settlers, though, the Remington-Lee had appeal. It was cheaper than a brand-new Winchester, chambered in a cartridge you could find almost anywhere, and rugged enough to handle the harsh realities of frontier life. Farmers, ranchers, and miners carried them not because they were glamorous, but because they worked. Here's the legacy twist. While the Winchester became the legend of dime novels in Hollywood, rifles like the Remington-Lee were the real everyman's gun. And today, because so few were produced and most were used hard, a surviving Lee is far rarer than a Winchester. And here's the myth-busting detail. The West wasn't only built on lever actions and cavalry rifles. It was also shaped by overlooked bolt actions like the Remington-Lee, a rifle that never became a household name but quietly kept countless settlers alive. And if you want more myth-busting stories about the real Wild West, not the Hollywood version, subscribing is the best way to make sure you don't miss them. Number 6. The Vetterli rifle, the Swiss Bite. Not every rifle carried on the frontier was American-made. In fact, one of the most advanced repeaters of the late 19th century came from across the Atlantic, the Swiss Vetterli. Introduced in the late 1860s, the Vetterli was one of the first military rifles in the world to combine a bolt-action system with a tubular magazine, giving it true repeating firepower at a time when most nations were still using single shots. Chambered in 10.4mm Swiss, it could hold up to a dozen rounds, an incredible amount of firepower for its era. Side by side with a Winchester, the Vetterli looked heavier and more European in styling, with its long barrel and chunky bolt handle. But in terms of firepower, it was way ahead of most American service rifles of the time. A frontier settler who managed to get one, often brought over by Swiss or Italian immigrants, had a repeater that could outshoot most opponents at both range and capacity. What made it especially interesting was how it filtered into America. Tens of thousands of Vetterlis were eventually sold off as surplus in Europe, and some made their way across the Atlantic, often ending up with immigrant families pushing west. They weren't common, but when you came across one, you knew you were looking at a rifle that gave its owner an edge few could match. The design was so successful that it influenced other European bolt-action repeaters, and it proved that the bolt-action could be more than just a single shot. Imagine being a homesteader defending your land with a rifle that carried twice as many rounds as your neighbor's Trapdoor Springfield. That's the kind of quiet advantage the Vetterli offered. And here's the legacy. Original Swiss Vetterlis are now prized by collectors, not only for their rarity in the American West, but also for their place in the global evolution of firearms. A rifle once seen as an immigrant's odd import is now recognized as one of the boldest steps toward the bolt-action age. Number 5. The Chassepot rifle, the needle gun experiment. While American gunmakers were perfecting lever actions and trapdoors, across the Atlantic the French were experimenting with something far more radical, the needle-fired paper cartridge rifle. Their creation was the Chassepot of 1866, one of the strangest rifles ever to drift into the American frontier. The Chassepot was revolutionary for its time. Instead of a brass cartridge, it fired a paper round ignited by a long, needle-like firing pin that pierced through to strike the primer. This made it one of the first bolt-action rifles to be adopted by a major military, giving French soldiers a huge leap in firepower during the Franco-Prussian War. For civilians or immigrants who brought them west, the Chassepot looked almost futuristic compared to the single-shot Springfields or muzzle loaders still in circulation. With its bolt-action system and powerful 11mm round, it offered settlers a faster, harder-hitting rifle than most American designs of the 1860s. But there was a catch. The paper cartridges were fragile, the needle system wore out quickly, and black powder fouling gummed up the mechanism after just a few shots. Compared to the metallic cartridges that were already taking over in the United States, the Chassepot was a finicky oddball. Still, it deserves credit. The Chassepot proved that bolt-action repeaters could work on a large scale, and it directly influenced the metallic cartridge designs that followed in Europe. On the American frontier, it remained a curiosity, rare, unusual, and often carried by immigrants who had brought them from overseas. Here's the myth-busting truth. While Hollywood always shows settlers armed with Winchesters, the reality is that a few of the most unusual imports, like the Chassepot, were also part of the West. And today, surviving examples are rare collector's pieces, a reminder of just how experimental the rifle world was in the mid-19th century. And speaking of experiments, while the Chassepot was trying to push technology with fragile paper cartridges, another rifle was about to arrive on the frontier, one that would take that same European lineage and evolve it into something sturdier, stronger, and far more practical. Number 4, the Peabody Martini Rifle, the frontier's last stand. By the late 1870s and 1880s, the Wild West was changing. Railroads carved across the plains, buffalo herds were vanishing, and frontier firefights were giving way to more organized law and order. Yet in the middle of that transition, a very different kind of rifle appeared in the American West. The Peabody Martini. Originally developed in the US by Henry Peabody, and later perfected in Britain with the Martini Action, this single-shot falling block rifle was a powerhouse. Chambered in large calibers like .577 to .450, it had a simple but incredibly strong breech that could handle heavy cartridges. Soldiers and hunters praised it for its durability and accuracy, and surplus examples trickled into the United States after European armies phased them out. On the frontier, a Peabody Martini was a curious sight. It wasn't American-made, and it didn't carry the romance of a Winchester lever action. But in raw performance, it rivaled or even exceeded many domestic designs. For immigrant settlers or adventurous hunters who picked one up, it offered accuracy and power that could take down game at long ranges or hold its own in a fight. But here's the problem. It arrived too late, and in too few numbers, to make a dent in the iconic story of the West. By the 1880s, Winchesters and trapdoors already defined the frontier rifle scene. Side by side, the Peabody Martini looked unusual and foreign, and reputation was everything. American shooters stuck with what they knew. Only a small number of these rifles ever crossed the Atlantic, which is why surviving examples with frontier provenance are vanishingly rare today. And here's the twist. Despite being technically excellent, the Peabody Martini became a symbol of missed opportunity, a rifle that could have changed the frontier landscape if it had arrived in greater numbers, but instead became a latecomer oddity. Today, because so few were carried westward, a Peabody Martini linked to Frontier Use Command's serious collector value. It wasn't remembered as the rifle that won the West. It was remembered as one of the last foreign designs to briefly flicker across it. Number 3, the Remington-Lee, the Winchester Challenger. If there was ever a rifle that came closest to rewriting the story of the Winchester, it was the Remington-Lee. Built in the late 1870s and 1880s, it was one of the boldest attempts to bring a modern bolt-action rifle into an American market still dominated by lever actions. And for a time, it very nearly succeeded. The Remington-Lee was ahead of its time. Chambered for powerful cartridges like the 4570, it wasn't just a single-shot breech loader. It featured a detachable box magazine, the first widely produced rifle in America to use one. That meant a shooter could load multiple rounds at once, fire rapidly, and swap out magazines decades before the idea would become military standard. In terms of toughness, the Remington-Lee was outstanding. Its bolt-action design was stronger than lever actions of the day, capable of handling heavier loads with more reliability. Soldiers who tested it praised its ruggedness and accuracy, and many hunters considered it a better-built rifle than the famous Winchester 1873 or 1876. Side by side with a Winchester, the Remington-Lee felt more modern, with a cleaner action and a different balance in the hand. Some users loved the detachable magazine, others found it strange compared to the tubular magazines they were used to, but few could deny it was every bit as capable, and in some ways superior. So why didn't it dethrone the Winchester? Timing and tradition. By the 1880s, the Winchester brand had already become a frontier legend, immortalized in dime novels and carried by countless settlers. The Remington-Lee might have been every bit as good, some would argue better, but Winchester's head start and cultural dominance kept it in the spotlight. Today, the Remington-Lee holds a special place in firearms history. Collectors and historians regard it as one of the most important missing links between the frontier lever actions and the modern military bolt action. It proved Winchester wasn't untouchable, and for a small but forward-thinking group of shooters, it was the rifle of choice when they wanted something rugged, reliable, and just a little ahead of its time. So let me throw this one to you. If you were a frontier scout in the 1880s, would you have trusted the cutting-edge Remington-Lee? Or stuck with the tried-and-true Winchester? Number 2. The Tarpley Carbine, the Confederate oddity. By the 1860s, most frontier rifles were being churned out by northern factories like Colt, Remington, or Sharps. But tucked away in the chaos of the Civil War, the Confederacy produced one of the strangest and rarest carbines ever built, the Tarpley. Designed by Jeremiah Tarpley and manufactured in Greensboro, North Carolina, this carbine was a bold attempt to supply Confederate cavalry with a breech-loading rifle. It used a unique swinging breech block system that allowed a rider to load quickly from the saddle at a time when most troops were still fumbling with muzzle loaders. Chambered in .52 caliber, it gave cavalrymen a significant edge in speed, at least in theory. The Tarpley's design was clever, but its execution left a lot to be desired. The action was fragile, the seal was poor, and accuracy was inconsistent. On top of that, production numbers were extremely limited. Only a few hundred were ever built before Confederate resources ran out. After the war, a handful of them trickled west, carried by veterans or sold as surplus curiosities. Compared to a Winchester or a Springfield, the Tarpley looked crude, almost experimental. But that oddity is exactly what makes it fascinating. It wasn't designed for hunters or settlers, it was born out of desperation, a stopgap weapon from a side struggling to keep pace with industrial firepower. And here's the myth-busting truth. While Hollywood loves to show every cowboy with a polished Winchester, the reality is that rare Confederate weapons like the Tarpley sometimes popped up on the frontier too. Because so few were made, surviving examples are now among the rarest Confederate carbines in existence, commanding sky-high prices at auction. It wasn't the most reliable or the most powerful, but the Tarpley carbine has a unique legacy. Like Colt's strange 4-shot cloverleaf revolver, it stood out not because it was perfect, but because it was different. And in today's collector world, different often means priceless. Number 1. The Krag Jørgensen, the rifle that closed the frontier. If there's one rifle that deserves the title of the rarest and strangest to brush against the Wild West, it's the Krag Jørgensen. Nicknamed simply the Krag, this wasn't just unusual. It was one of the most mechanically advanced rifles of its time. First developed in Norway in the late 1880s and tested by the US military soon after, the Krag was light years ahead of the old trapdoors and lever actions. Its signature feature was a unique side-loading magazine door. Instead of feeding rounds one by one into a tube or fumbling with a single-shot breech, you could flip open the magazine gate, drop in multiple cartridges at once, and have a bolt-action repeater ready for action. For the late frontier, that was revolutionary. The Krag was eventually adopted by the US Army in 1892, but even before that, a handful of trials rifles and prototypes were tested and circulated in limited numbers. A few of these ended up in civilian hands at the very tail end of the Wild West, carried by scouts, officers, and adventurous frontiersmen who wanted the very latest in firepower. Compared to a Springfield Trapdoor, the Krag felt like something from the future, smoother, faster, and capable of sustained fire with full-power ammunition. But here's the catch. It arrived just as the frontier was closing. By the 1890s, the buffalo were gone, the Indian Wars were over, and the Wild West was quickly becoming a memory. The Krag wasn't remembered as the rifle that conquered the plains. It was remembered as the one that came right as the Old West was disappearing into history. And here's the legacy. Today, Krag trial rifles and early models are among the rarest frontier-era firearms you can find. Their advanced design, low production numbers, and timing at the very end of the West make them incredibly valuable to collectors. In the end, the Krag wasn't just a rifle. It was a symbol of transition, marking the moment when the black powder frontier gave way to the smokeless modern age. It closed the book on the Wild West, while opening a new chapter in American military history. And there you have it, the 15 rarest rifles of the Wild West. From awkward paper cartridge carbines and immigrant imports, to bold bolt actions and the futuristic Krag, these rifles prove the frontier was far stranger and more inventive than Hollywood ever shows. Most people picture the Wild West as a land of Winchesters and trapdoors, but as you've seen today, there were dozens of unusual designs that shaped real lives on the frontier. Rifles carried by soldiers, settlers, hunters, and scouts alike. Some became footnotes, others became collector's treasures, but every single one tells a story about survival, innovation, and the reality of the American frontier. So, which of these rare rifles surprised you the most? Did you already know about the Krag, or was the Hotchkiss or Chassepot a total shock to you? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We love seeing which of these hidden gems catches you off guard. And if you enjoyed this dive into the forgotten side of the Wild West, hit that like button. It really helps keep these stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the weapons, legends, and myths of the frontier, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Until next time, keep exploring and remember, the truth about the Wild West is always stranger than the legend.